So, in 1994, DSM-IV reaches the end of its shelf life and is replaced, DSM-III, sorry, and is replaced by DSM-IV, which remains the DSM in use for 20 years, right up until May 2013, when it's replaced by DSM-V. Yeah. Okay, so in 2013, I had the opportunity to interview the new chairperson of DSM-IV, Dr. Alan Francis, who took over from Robert Spitzer, on 2 separate occasions. And so one of the first questions I had to him was, with the benefit of hindsight, was there anything you did when constructing DSM-IV that you now regret? And this is what he had to say. Well, the first thing I have to say about that is that DSM-IV was a remarkably unambitious and modest effort to stabilize psychiatric diagnosis, not to create new problems. This meant keeping the introduction of new disorders to an absolute minimum. What did he mean by that? Well, his team only introduced 8 new mental disorders into the main manual, which is a modest amount compared to the 80 introduced by Spitzer. However, from another standpoint, this claim to modesty is very shaky because it excludes the following. His team actually created 30 new mental disorders, but put them in the appendix, and subdivided many existing conditions, in effect creating new ones. So if you count the appendix inclusions and the subdivisions, all of which people can and are diagnosed with, then his team expanded the DSM from around 270 disorders to around 370 disorders, which is the very opposite of modesty and conservatism. So we carried on. Yet despite that conservatism, Francis said, and I let the comment slip, we learned some pretty tough lessons. We learned overall that even if you make minimal changes to the DSM, the way the world uses the manual is not always the way you intended it to be used. Can I just pick up on that just for one moment? I'm sorry I have to, but the way the world uses the manual, so it's the world who's at fault, right? If there are any mental health professionals here in the room who in good faith use these manuals, and you do in good faith, it's your fault. It's not their fault, it's your fault, by the way. Okay, so the way the world uses the manual is not always the way intended it to be used. For instance, we added bipolar 2, Asperger's disorder, and finally we added ADHD. And well, these decisions help promote 3 false epidemics in psychiatry. I asked him what he meant by that. Well, we now have a rate of autism that is 20 times what it was 15 years ago. By adding bipolar 2, a milder version of bipolar, we also doubled the ratio of bipolar versus unipolar depression, resulting in lots more use of antipsychotic and mood stabilizer drugs. Rates of ADHD also tripled, partly because new drug treatments were released that were aggressively marketed. So every decision you make has a trade-off, and you can't assume the way you write the DSM will be the way it will be used. There he goes again. So the way the DSM is being used has led to the medicalization of a number of people who really don't warrant their diagnoses. Exactly. Can you put a figure on how many people have been wrongly medicalized? There is no right answer to who should be diagnosed. There is no gold standard for psychiatric diagnosis. So it's impossible to know for sure. But when the diagnosis rates triple over the course of 15 years, my assumption is that medicalization is going on. Powerful statement for him to make. He was the chairperson of DSM-IV. But could the situation be even worse than this? I would argue absolutely it could be, and it is. Because he's only talking about the 8 disorders he put into the main manual. He's not talking about the subdivisions and the appendix inclusions, all of which medicalize more and more painful normality. He's also not talking about the existing problem of over-medicalization he allowed to live on, created by DSM-III, allowed to live on into DSM-IV, right? He allowed DSM-III to carry on He's not talking about that either. Think of some of the disorders he allowed to live on. We had disorders like female orgasmic disorder. Yeah. Caffeine-related disorders. Stammering, stuttering, transsexualism, oppositional defiant disorder, which is something I evidently acutely suffer from. Look, nobody is suggesting that these things aren't experienced as problems by certain people. I'm sure they are. But whether or not they constitute psychiatric illnesses is another matter entirely. So my final question for Alan Francis was this. With the benefit of hindsight, why isn't it you just simply scrapped a lot of what went on before on the basis of, number one, it enjoyed woeful scientific support, and on the basis, number two, that it was much of this stuff was frankly eccentric. And this is how he responded. If we were going to either add new diagnoses or eliminate existing ones, there had to be substantial scientific evidence to support that decision. And there simply wasn't. So by following our own conservative rules, we couldn't reduce the system any more than we could increase it. Now, you could argue that that is a questionable approach, but we felt it was important to stabilize the system and not make arbitrary decisions in either direction. But one of the problems with proceeding in that way, I said, is that it assumes the DSM system you inherited from Spitzer was fit for purpose. For example, it assumes that the disorders Spitzer included and the diagnostic threshold Spitzer's team set were themselves scientifically established. We did not assume that at all. We knew that everything that came before was arbitrary. Francis quickly corrects himself. We knew that most decisions that came before were arbitrary. I had been involved in DSM-III. I understood its limitations probably more than most people did, but the most important value at that time was to stabilize the system, not change it arbitrarily. So, you are essentially saying that you set out to stabilize the arbitrary decisions that were made during the construction of DSM-III? In other words, corrected Francis, it felt better to stabilize the existing arbitrary decisions than to create a whole new assortment of new ones. And I thought that was a very good place to bring the interview to a close. All right, so one final paragraph before we have a very short break. So drawing this part of the lecture to a close, what I have discussed today, I believe, poses a serious challenge to those who embrace the conventional view that mental disorders are discrete patterns of biologically rooted pathological feeling and behavior identified by way of objective research processes. What an inspection of the construction of DSM rather reveals is that the separate disorders into which DSM organized diverse behavioral and mental phenomena were largely the outcome of vote-based judgments settled by a small, culturally homogeneous subset of mental health professionals who were socially positioned at a given time to have their judgments ratified by the institutional apparatus of the American Psychiatric Association. Now, while such judgments may indicate that a group of professionals sharing similar socio-cultural beliefs, biases, persuasions, and interests may see some things in the same way at a given point in time, they do not confirm that what they see is either objectively true, universal, or indeed stable in any verifiable sense.